Okay, I can check this off the list. It's pretty good. Now I can just, do the next one. I wonder which one I'll do. Decisions. Well, I don't know. No real rush, right? Let's check Twitter. Before I get into this, I'd like to set up how I decided to tackle this takedown, which I've had on my mind for literal years. I watched this show years ago, got halfway in, and dropped it because it fucking sucks. Time skip to today, when as of this writing, I'm scrambling to do this, as I now have an actual deadline where if I don't finish it, my points will be completely overshadowed by someone better than me doing it in the same format. So not to embarrass myself in the scramble, I tried looking into what good things people had to say about the show. Maybe with that context, I'll have a better understanding of why people like it, and maybe I'll change my own mind and not have to risk being wrong on the internet. And I found a whole lot of nothing. All people mostly had to say amounted to it was just good. Many were straight up lying. The show has some of the most garbage art and animation I've seen literally ever, and many people will try to tell you otherwise. One review tried to actually make a joke about it and immediately pretended they were kidding, pretending as if the times where these aspects weren't utterly awful were just diamonds in the rough. Just say it, it's bad. The most nuanced opinion I found of this awful show took the homosexuality expressed by some of the characters as part of the dystopia and went on to say the show was boring, ugly, and terribly paced, but was somehow still good. From what I could gather, what most people seem to like, for some reason, was its world building, its characters, and its themes. So let's take this one step at a time. The world building sucks! Alright, let's do an experiment. The basis of this experiment lies in a book called The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell. In this book, Schell describes how important a world is to capture the imagination of audiences, for both adults and children. For instance, many children got their parents to buy them Star Wars figures. I myself had so many Star Wars Lego sets, my parents probably accrued a small debt for it. Schell did his own research into this and found the vast majority of these children used these figures to tell their own stories in the Star Wars universe, often using iconic figures to portray their own characters. Let's extrapolate this to internet users, specifically fans of different pieces of art who are inspired by those pieces of art to create their own stories within the worlds of those art pieces. First, let's look at Shin Sekai Yori itself. Alright, about 50 pieces of fanfiction on fanfiction.net as of the day of this writing. Now let's take a look at Mal for a second. Shin Sekai Yori is ranked number 113 based on its score. I happen to really like Magi the Kingdom of Magic, and I think its world is pretty dope, and it's ranked very closely. Fewer people even have it listed on Mal, and it came out almost a year later. Surely it'll have fewer... Well, alright, maybe that was just a botch. After all, Magi is twice as long, and much more exciting in general. Maybe a show like Mushishi is a bit more of a fair comparison. It's higher ranked in score, but it's about as popular, and the world built around it is pretty interesting too. And it has a chill vibe. Let's see. Still almost 3 times as many. Okay. What if the show is just deeper than what I remember? People mention that aspect all the time too. Let's compare it to Serial Experiments Lain. Sure, Lane is much older, but it's a fucking dense show, and its raw rank and popularity are much lower. Maybe we found our Oh, come on! Okay, either this show is fucking garbage, or the fan must revere this work so much as a finished product that they don't want more to happen in this universe. Spoiler alert. It's fucking garbage. I know this is hard to tell in the heat of watching an exciting show like Shin Sekai Yori, but the vast majority of this show's world building takes place between 2 conversations. The first takes place over about 12 minutes as the main cast learns about the history that brought them to the present. And the second takes place over about 15 minutes as Saki learns why the current society operates as it does. These conversations are not broken by anything. I call them conversations, but what's actually happening is that the character that knows stuff is just vomiting exposition at the other parties continuously. Let me reiterate, almost all of Shin Sekai's world building is delivered by a single character talking. And the thing is, they had opportunity to deliver the world building in more interesting ways. Hell, a couple times they did. At the start of a couple episodes, they show some short animations of past regimes rising and falling. However, instead of actually working them into the story and having the characters figure out the history gradually, with the ability to respond and digest each piece, they throw that shit aside and just explain it all. The first conversation literally has the camera switching angles and perspective on just the people involved in the conversation. At least the second one had the decency to weave the conversation into a sort of sub-narrative, even if it was ultimately still pretty boring and uninteresting. Which brings me to my next point. The world building is boring and uninteresting. See, an interesting world means a world that is interesting to live in. Not necessarily that I want to live in the world, it's just if I did, I can see myself getting into interesting scenarios as a consequence of living in that world. That's why original character culture is so prevalent. People want to project themselves into other worlds for whatever reason suits them. Now, let's consider the prospects of living in Shin Sekai Yori. You're a brainwashed sheep, part of a corrupt and morally bankrupt system you believe is entirely justified, and are limited to living in the confines of a specific area. There is no exploring outside. Your entire purpose is probably living in some bureaucratic office that doesn't care about you or your family. And you're okay with that. You have to be. The only way you wouldn't be okay with it is if the leader of the town wanted to make you her heir. Or, you're a rodent person who is more than likely a chattel slave, forced to hard labor by your own people whose masters can and probably will wipe you and your entire colony out because of some misunderstanding or just because one of them feels like it. If you're lucky, you're born into a powerful colony and can be recognized as a speaker for your colony if you're clever. If not, you're probably just a warrior who will die unnamed on the battlefield. Your life belongs to your colony and is more than likely forfeit if any conflict arises. Those are literally your only reasonable choices. There is no nuance to either of them. You have no initiative. You have no real power. But that's just the world as it is. What about how the world came to be? Well, if we take everything in the anime into account, honestly, there isn't very much depth or thought put into the world building either. We know that psychics came about, and for some reason, school shooters caused the world to collapse. It's not explained why this is. There is no indication that psychic powers change the way people behave. It's just taken for granted that if some people got psychic abilities, of course the first thing they do is kill everyone. I'm not saying the world wouldn't change in big ways, but I'm not convinced everyone would just default to senseless violence if they had the ability to. This is because we have evidence that this isn't the case. Sure, many violent rampages happen on the regular, but these incidents usually involve tens of people where millions exist. I'm not convinced that psychic powers necessarily eclipse what one man can do with a significant number of guns and explosives. The most powerful psychic attacks seem to equate to that much, if anything. I can get more specific with why the world building doesn't make much sense as the world continues to change, like how the death of shame makes no sense to implement, or how the experts of science seem to have, simultaneously, a complete understanding of human biology and physiology, and a complete lack of understanding therein. But I think that it'd only be a little less boring than the show itself, and I think I've made my point well enough. While thought is put into the state of the world at different points in time, there isn't a lot of thought put into those transitionary periods, and yeah, those are important too. Moving along. The characters suck! I don't think I've seen less compelling or nuanced characters in any piece of fiction in recent memory than the ones featured in Shin Sekai Yori. The main fucking character's canonical defining character trait, recognized in universe, is that she doesn't change. Don't let this fool you, because that isn't special. None of these characters ever change. As they grow up, they remain the same character, they just have more knowledge. Saki is a stubborn and somewhat irritable girl who wants to know the truth, and is compassionate at her core. Satoru is an energetic but strangely realist kid who is prideful and is punched by Saki a lot. Shun is a quiet genius who, when he does speak, speaks his mind. Maria is a headstrong, decently powerful psychic who cares about her friends. Mamoru is a nice guy and a coward who doesn't like knowing real shit. If you can point me to an episode where any of these characters aren't being what I've described here, and no more than that, I'd be pretty impressed because Jesus Christ, I felt like I've spent an eternity on this show and we're like a quarter ways through this project. Again, I'd like to repeat that acquiring more knowledge is not character growth. None of these characters change in response to, well, anything. These kids see war, have unspeakable truths most adults in this world don't know, and come back on the other side exactly the way they've always been, and will remain like that for the entirety of their lives. I think the only singular change in the series is that Satoru and Saki eventually become friendlier towards each other, and it feels like that's happening just by default. Not to say that isn't realistic, it just isn't very satisfying. Neither were particularly interested in each other even as we got significantly deep into the series. They just decided that since they're the sole survivors of their friend group, they may as well just fucking start a family. At least, at the pace at which it happens, that's how it feels. And it's doubly hilarious because people call this a coming-of-age story. Alright, look. Yes, the characters are literally coming of age. But the thing is, that's not what any of this is about. It doesn't actually matter to the overall story that the characters are growing up. At least not as the story is told. This is because they don't fucking change. There is no loss of innocence. There is no growing up. Not really. This isn't even a little about coming of age. It just features the characters of the series becoming adults. If all the characters in this story were adults who found the same knowledge, literally nothing would have turned out differently. All of the characters maintain the same thought process over the course of the series. This doesn't hinge on their age at all. Outside the main cast are actually a couple pretty decent characters, funnily enough. Squealer, for example, is equal parts a bastard and also completely right. This is just about the only widely accepted opinion of the show I can give credit to. I don't even really like him, but he does some evil fucked up shit and he has a perfectly reasoned argument for why he's doing it. And I can see why that kind of character gets a lot of love. I mean, just about every character that does something like this is well liked in different fan bases, because the character is nuanced. I can say the same for the lead of the humans in the show, that old lady. Tomiko, right. She has the same sort of one part evil and one part well-meaning to her character. She is the one who basically invented the society as it exists today. The society which prides human existence and also procedurally culls its populace, and maintains supremacy over physically lesser intelligent creatures. She's basically Hitler, but in a world where there is no want to cull races so much as psychically inept people. In the end, I found her more repulsive than Squealer, but still one of the more interesting characters for the nuance she offered. Does either character save the show? No fucking way. Why? Because the themes suck! This show, above everything else, is about its themes. The world, the characters, fucking everything is about trying to convey specific themes. But the kicker here is that it does a terrible job at exploring them. And see, this builds on everything else I've mentioned. The themes don't work in a large part because the world and characters don't work. The characters are born into a dystopian society with ideals mirroring that society. They have to change in response to the world for the future to turn out better, but they don't. That bittersweet ending is not realistic because the characters have not changed their opinion on their place in the world. Humanity and what comprises it is one of the central themes of the show, for example. All of the human characters, including Saki, regard monster rats as inhuman, as below them, because that's what they were taught. From the get-go, Saki is kind enough to help them when they're in need, and she has the ability to help, but this is not about recognizing their personhood. It's just that Saki isn't cruel, and she doesn't see the point in being cruel to anybody. All the others, at best, have no opinion of the monster rats. At worst, they hold the same opinion as everyone else. They aren't human and don't deserve human decency. At the end of the show, does this change? No. No, it doesn't. Saki still isn't sure whether she thinks monster rats are people or not. In the very last episode, Satoru reaffirms that monster rats aren't human. Saki doesn't take the opposing side. Up to this point, whenever Satoru particularly said something she didn't agree with, she snapped. Here, she just stays silent. Obviously, she's conflicted, but for this theme to be upheld, she needed to have resolved at this point, more than any other point. This makes it feel like her new struggle to keep the monster rats from extermination is just an act of pity. She knows it would be cruel, and she has a promise to keep. It's not about their humanity. This is reinforced by the predicament surrounding this particular conversation. At this point, the monster rats have proven that they are just as intelligent as humans. However, nobody in this show has any self-awareness. It doesn't matter that they're intelligent creatures who can form emotional connections and have nuanced opinions on complicated issues. It doesn't matter that they can form different societies, create ideologies, and advance technology. It doesn't matter that they can respond to human cruelty in kind. No, what the show decides actually matters is their biology. What spurs this conversation is the forbidden finding that monster rats most likely were modified humans all along, as if that would have invalidated the entire argument. The same can be said about its themes involving eugenics, authoritarianism, ideology, and just about everything else. The show draws no definitive conclusion but also leaves nothing open to interpretation. The main character just doesn't have a solid grip on these concepts even though she's encountered them throughout her entire life. And I'm expected to believe she's going to make life better when she's the only person with the context to have an answer to these questions? Yeah, okay. There's really no one thing that makes this show fall apart. That it's boring and unengaging is one thing, but this show isn't trying to be those things. It's trying to be thought-provoking and smart, and it utterly fails at doing it. It's smart enough to set up interesting themes, that is, themes that are interesting on their own, but it's not smart enough to actually understand and explore them. It constantly shoots stuff in the foot and misses its own point so much, it's legitimately frustrating to know that people enjoy this show with all these faults. Faults which go directly against the point of the show that all these people interpret the show to have. Now, I've seen the show compared to another show that's pretty big on its philosophy, Psycho Pass. However, there's a big distinction to be made here. Psycho-Pass is a good show. Continued in Part 2. If you're watching this, I may as well remind you that if you like this video, like the video. Share it with your friends, especially if you know them to like Shin Sekai Yori for some reason. If I changed or validated your opinion, consider donating to my Patreon linked in the description. If you somehow still think Shin Sekai Yori is good, drop a comment explaining why. If I feel it's got a point, I will respond to it. And that's it from me. See ya.